Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. You ever feel like life is just kind of playing on hard mode and you're stuck just trying to figure things out the hard way?
Yeah, definitely.
Well, today we're diving into a book that claims to offer a different path.
Okay.
We're tackling 12 Rules for Life by Jordan Peterson,
Right.
a book that sparked global conversation, controversy, and maybe even a few life changes.
Hmm.
So grab your metaphorical notebooks because we're about to break down some seriously thought-provoking stuff.
That's good.
You've sent us a bunch of excerpts from the book itself, along with some articles analyzing Peterson's personality, his background, how those things shape his message. You want to understand not just what he's saying, but why he's saying it,
Yeah,
and what it means for you practically, right?
that's the core of it. What's interesting is that Peterson himself is a bit of a paradox. He is this clinical psychologist, a former Harvard professor, someone who's clearly deeply intellectual, but he doesn't talk down to his audience. He blends this academic rigor with an almost unedited conversational style,
Yeah,
kind of like we're doing here, actually.
it's true. And I think that's part of why he resonates with so many people. He's talking about these universal human experiences, things like figuring out who you are dealing with chaos and uncertainty and trying to find meaning in a world that doesn't always make sense. And he does it in a way that feels both smart and relatable.
Exactly. He's not afraid to get into the nitty-gritty of difficult topics, but he also manages to connect with people on an emotional level.
Yeah.
And that leads us perfectly to his first rule, which is probably his most famous: stand up straight with your shoulders back. Now, you might be thinking, okay, is this just a posture lesson?
Uh-huh, right.
But it goes so much deeper than that.
This is where Peterson gets into the idea of dominance hierarchies, right?
Exactly.
I remember reading about the whole lobster analogy and thinking, wait, what do lobsters have to do with my life?
It's actually a really fascinating connection. Peterson argues that lobsters, being incredibly ancient creatures, share a biological system with humans that links posture to serotonin levels. And social status, basically standing tall, literally makes you feel more confident. And it also signals to others that you're someone to be reckoned with.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this connects to the whole self-improvement thing, but wouldn't this imply that some people are just naturally wired to be at the top of these hierarchies? What about those of us who don't feel naturally dominant?
That's where personal responsibility comes in. Peterson acknowledges that these hierarchies exist, but he emphasizes that posture is something you can control by consciously changing how you carry yourself. You can actually influence your own neurochemistry and how others perceive you.
So even if I'm not naturally the alpha lobster, I can still make choices that improve my confidence and my standing in the world. I can see how that would be empowering for people.
Absolutely, and it ties into a bigger theme in Peterson's work, the idea that meaning and responsibility are more important than just chasing happiness. He argues that a lot of people, especially younger generations, have been sold this idea that happiness is the ultimate goal, but it's often a fleeting and unreliable target.
It's like that Instagram perfect life that everyone's chasing, but that never seems to actually satisfy anyone. So what does Peterson offer as an alternative?
He suggests that finding meaning, taking responsibility for your life, and striving to become a better person are much more fulfilling pursuits, and that's where his observations about his own students come in. He noticed that many of them who were raised with a heavy emphasis on individual rights actually found a lot of comfort in his message of personal responsibility.
That's super interesting. Why do you think that is? It seems counterintuitive that a generation focused on me would be drawn to the idea of responsibility.
Well, think about it this way. If you're constantly being told that you're entitled to certain things, but you're not given a clear sense of purpose or direction, it can actually create a lot of anxiety and emptiness. Peterson's message provides a framework for action. It says, okay, you have these rights, but you also have responsibilities to yourself and to the world around you.
It's like he's providing a compass and a map for people who feel lost in a world of endless options, but no real direction.
Exactly, and this sense of purpose and direction is essential for navigating what Peterson calls the chaos of being. He argues that suffering is an inherent part of life, and that without a shared value system, without something to strive for, we become overwhelmed by that suffering.
This reminds me of his rule about comparing yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. It's rule 4, right?
That's right. It's easy to get caught in the trap of comparing ourselves to others, especially in the age of social media, where everyone's curating their perfect online persona. Peterson argues that this kind of comparison is not only unhelpful, but also deeply demoralizing.
We've all been down that social media rabbit hole of feeling inadequate because someone else seems to be living a more exciting or successful life. But how do we escape that trap?
Peterson suggests shifting our focus inward instead of comparing ourselves to others. We should compare ourselves to who we were yesterday, last week, or last year. It's about recognizing our own progress and focusing on continual self-improvement.
So it's not about striving for some unattainable ideal of perfection, but about acknowledging our own growth and making small incremental improvements over time.
That's a great way to put it, and this focus on self-improvement ties into another important aspect of Peterson's work, the dangers of trying to rescue others. This is where he gets into some really thought-provoking territory, drawing on Dostoevsky's notes from Underground to illustrate his point.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What does Peterson mean by rescuing others, and why does he see it as dangerous? Let's unpack that in part two.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Before the break, we were talking about Jordan Peterson's ideas about rescuing others.
This is where Peterson really challenges some conventional wisdom, right? Like we're often taught that helping others is a good thing, almost a moral imperative. But Peterson seems to be suggesting that it's not always that simple.
Exactly. He uses Dostoevsky's notes from Underground to illustrate this point. The main character in that book is this deeply cynical and isolated individual who fancies himself a savior of sorts, but his attempts to help others are actually driven by his own ego and ultimately do more harm than good.
So it's not about the intention to help, but about the motivation behind it and the actual impact it has on the person you're trying to help.
Precisely. Peterson argues that sometimes our attempts to rescue others are actually a form of narcissism disguised as compassion. We might be trying to fix other people's problems to make ourselves feel better or to validate our own sense of superiority.
That's a really insightful point. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking we know what's best for others, especially when we see them struggling. But Peterson seems to be saying that true compassion involves recognizing the other person's agency and respecting their choices, even if we disagree with them.
That's a key takeaway. He's not saying we shouldn't help others, but that we should be discerning in our compassion. We should help those who truly want help and avoid getting dragged down by those who choose to remain in their suffering.
It's like that saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Sometimes the most compassionate thing we can do is step back and allow people to make their own choices, even if it means they make mistakes.
And this idea of allowing for mistakes for learning through experience is central to Peterson's emphasis on discipline and punishment. He draws on the work of B.F. Skinner, a prominent behavioral psychologist, to argue that consequences are essential for learning and growth.
Okay, this is where things can get a bit controversial. Peterson's views on discipline have definitely sparked a lot of debate, especially his use of the phrase minimum necessary force. Can you unpack that a bit for us?
Absolutely. It's important to understand this concept within the context of Peterson's broader philosophy. He's not advocating for violence or abuse in any way. He's talking about establishing clear boundaries and using the least amount of force necessary to enforce those boundaries.
So it's about setting clear expectations and then consistently following through with appropriate consequences.
Exactly. And he uses a personal anecdote about his son refusing to eat as an example. He describes how he used minimum necessary force to ensure his son ate not through punishment, but by calmly and persistently insisting that he eat until he finally did.
So it's more about consistency and follow-through than about using physical force.
Right, and he contrasts this approach with the overprotective parenting style where children are shielded from all discomfort and consequences. Peterson argues that this kind of overprotection actually makes children weaker and less resilient in the long run.
It's like we're trying to create a world where kids never experience any setbacks or failures, but then they're completely unprepared when they inevitably face those things in adulthood.
That's a great way to put it, and this ties back to his rule about setting your own house in order before you criticize the world. It's Rule 6, right?
Yes, it seems like Peterson is saying that we need to focus on developing our own character and taking responsibility for our own lives before we try to go out and change the world.
Exactly, and this sense of personal responsibility is grounded in a deeper understanding of truth and meaning. Peterson suggests that true meaning in life comes from aligning ourselves with something greater than ourselves, something that transcends our immediate desires and gratifications.
Okay, I can definitely see how that connects to his critique of modern ideologies, which we touched on earlier.
Oh.
Peterson is pretty critical of ideologies that he sees as overly simplistic or that demonize entire groups of people.
This is definitely one of the more controversial aspects of his work. Peterson argues that many modern ideologies, particularly those rooted in identity politics, offer a distorted view of history and human nature. He challenges the idea of oppression as it's often presented, arguing that the narrative is often oversimplified and ignores the complexities of power dynamics and the progress that has been made throughout history.
He uses a really interesting example to illustrate this point, doesn't he? Something about the tampon king of India.
Yes. It's a powerful anecdote that challenges the narrative that all men are inherently oppressive towards women. He tells the story of Arunachalam Murugantham, a man who dedicated his life to creating affordable and accessible sanitary pads for women in rural India, even facing ridicule and ostracism from his own community for doing so.
It's a great example of how individuals can challenge societal norms and make a positive impact regardless of their gender or social status.
And it highlights the importance of looking beyond simplistic narratives and recognizing the nuances and complexities of real-world issues.
So we've got personal responsibility, a nuanced view of compassion, a call for discipline and boundaries, and a critique of ideology. Where does Peterson take us from here?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. He delves into the world of ancient myths and biblical stories, using them to explore profound truths about the human condition. It might sound unexpected, but trust me, it's fascinating. Stay tuned for part 3, where we unpack Peterson's exploration of the tragedy and fragility of being, along with his final challenge for living a meaningful life.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're in the final stretch of our exploration of Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, and things are about to get pretty philosophical.
That's right. Peterson doesn't shy away from the big questions about the nature of existence, the inevitability of suffering, and the search for meaning in a world that can often feel chaotic and absurd.
He even brings in his own personal experiences to illustrate these points, right? I remember reading about his daughter's health struggles and how that shaped his perspective on life.
Yeah, Mikhaila's long battle with severe juvenile rheumatoid arthritis is a recurring theme in the book. It's a powerful example of how, even in the midst of immense suffering, it's still possible to find meaning and purpose.
It must have been incredibly difficult for him to share such personal and vulnerable experiences with the world.
It speaks to the depth of his exploration. He doesn't just offer abstract theories. He connects them to real-life experiences, both his own and those of his patients and students. And this leads him to a fascinating philosophical question, which he illustrates through a Jewish story about an all-powerful being.
I'm intrigued. What's the story, and what does it have to do with finding meaning in life?
The story poses this question: what does an omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent being lack? In other words, what does a being who knows everything is everywhere and can do anything actually need? And the answer is limitations.
That's a surprising answer. Why would an all-powerful being need limitations? It seems counterintuitive.
Peterson argues that without limitations, without something to strive for, to push against existence becomes meaningless. He suggests that being itself requires becoming, and that becoming necessarily involves overcoming obstacles, facing challenges, and pushing beyond our current limits.
So it's not about achieving some static state of perfection, but about the ongoing process of growth and transformation.
Exactly, and this is where the concept of stories becomes really important. Peterson argues that humans are storytelling creatures. We make sense of the world and our place in it by creating narratives about ourselves and our experiences.
He even uses the example of Superman to illustrate this point, right?
Yes. He talks about how Superman became less compelling as a character when he became too powerful without real challenges or vulnerabilities. His story became less interesting, less relatable.
That makes sense. We need to see characters struggle and overcome obstacles in order to connect with them on an emotional level. It's the same with our own lives, isn't it?
Absolutely. Peterson is essentially saying that a meaningful life is one that has a good story to tell, and a good story has conflict, tension, setbacks, and ultimately some kind of resolution or transformation.
So how do we go about writing that good story with our own lives?
This is where we get to Peterson's final challenge, which he beautifully illustrates through his experience with a pen of light gifted to him by a friend.
Okay, a pen of light, that sounds pretty symbolic.
It represents the power of intention, of consciously choosing the direction of our lives and the stories we tell about ourselves. Peterson uses this pen to ask himself difficult questions and then to write down the answers that emerge.
What kind of questions is he asking?
Questions like, what shall I do tomorrow? What shall I do next year? What shall I do with my life? These are questions about purpose, about aligning our actions with our values, about creating a life that has meaning and significance.
And what answers does he find?
His answers are all about aiming for the highest good, about maximizing the amount of good he can do in the world. He challenges himself to be precise in his speech, to set his sights high, and to act with intention and purpose.
That's a powerful call to action. It's not just about self-improvement for its own sake, but about using that self-improvement to make a positive impact on the world around us.
Exactly. And he leaves us with a final thought-provoking question. If our lives are stories, what kind of story are you telling? What kind of hero are you becoming?
Wow, that's something I'm definitely going to be reflecting on. This has been an incredibly rich and thought-provoking exploration of Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. If you're as intrigued by these ideas as we are, be sure to check out the full book. We've included a link in the description below, and be sure to let us know your thoughts in the comments, what resonated with you the most.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video if you found it valuable. Let's keep the conversation going.